Welcome. My name is Paul Gilza. I'm a developer relations engineer here at platform.sh and Upsun. But before that, I was a customer. I spent a number of years at the University of Missouri, where myself and a colleague were responsible for managing the university's fleet of websites and building the strategy for managing that fleet. And then I was in charge specifically of those WordPress sites. So that's exactly what I'm going to talk to you today during this webinar is some tips, some tricks, some strategies that you can utilize to managing a lot of WordPress sites all at once without driving yourself crazy. So some quick warnings real fast before we get started. One is that what I'm going to talk to you about today is not the only way that you can do this. There's probably going to be a moment during this webinar where you go, wait, but can't you do it this other? Yeah, exactly. There are probably going to be some things I show you that are not going to be the best way for you. In fact, may not be the best way in general, but the specific way that you need, the best way for you is going to very much depend on your restrictions, your requirements, the things that you're working underneath. So just realize that what I'm going to show you is more to give you some ideas and inspire you to help you build the strategy that's going to work best for you. And it's the things that I've come across having had done this for a number of years. The last is this is not the official platform's Upsun way to do these things. These are not the way that we are suggesting you do them. Again, this is purely for inspiration and developing your own strategies. Now, I'm going to be working under a collection of assumptions. So to share those with you, first is I'm going to assume that you're using Git and Git repositories to manage your projects, your websites. I'm also going to assume that you're going to use or you're using some type of cloud host. Ideally, you'll be using us, since I'm going to feature us throughout this. But if not, that you at least have access to configure and control your infrastructure through some configuration file. In addition, as I begin to show some code samples, I'm going to assume that the branch named main is your production branch, and the branch name update is where we're going to perform a lot of these updates. Now, if you're using a cloud host, again, like ours, you've most likely run into the issue or challenge with WordPress in that the application container, once it's built, is read-only. So we can't perform, we can't access those nice, easy updates that's inside the WordPress GUI. So we're going to assume that's the case and kind of move forward from there. So the very first thing that we need to do, I'm going to scoot up here a little bit. Very first thing we have to do is we need an inventory. We need to know what it is that we're dealing with. No different than the security realm where we can't secure the things that we don't know we own. We can't build a really solid global strategy to manage a fleet of sites until we know what we're dealing with. So we've got to have that inventory. We've got to start researching. We've got to start analyzing the differences between projects. Now, some differences are assumed and expected, right? Not every site is the exact same. They're going to need different plugins, different themes. But what we're really looking for here is the differences in configuration and setup. One of the strengths of WordPress is that you can set up and configure a WordPress in a multitude of ways. But in terms of trying to manage a large fleet, that becomes really challenging. So we want to analyze and look and identify those areas that are different, but realize or begin to understand why they're different. Are they different because they need to be different? There's a special unique case, or are they simply a difference in opinions or preference in how something is set up? In addition, we need to look for commonality, those areas that are exactly the same or very, very similar from project to project, because those are going to be those things that we can really begin to build standards on. And that's what we're trying to do in this kind of global or big space is we want to develop some standards. Now, standards and standardization can be a very challenging, not challenge, that's not the right word, a very volatile word, right? Sometimes developers hear standards and they think we're trying to box them in or limit their creativity. And that's not the case. What we're trying to do is identify those areas that we can build on top of that are going to make management easier with an eye towards flexibility and building in the use case for knowing that sites are going to have some differences down the line. So the next concept that I want to share with you in terms of trying to get your head around how to manage these is a concept of upstream and downstream repositories and upstream collections. So the upstream is the base, or kind of the global area that all new projects are going to start from. It's where all of our standardization lives. Now you may be thinking, all right, well, isn't that just a boilerplate? Yeah, in a lot of ways it is the boilerplate. It's where we're going to start a new project from. But unlike a boilerplate, we usually, when you use a boilerplate, you start the project, but then there is no longer a relationship between that new project and that boilerplate. Instead, we want to make sure we're retaining that relationship from that new project back up to that collection of standards, because we need to make sure we can incorporate and push those new standards down to all of our projects. So you may be saying, well, isn't that a fork? Yeah, it's pretty close to a fork. The difference, though, is that most of the version control management systems like GitLab, GitHub, Bitbucket, either will only allow you to have one fork of a project or of a repo inside of a namespace, or they all assume that the purpose of that fork is to make changes and then push back up to that original. And in that case, we don't want. Downstream projects, those new projects, they should never be pushing back up to that canonical root source for our standards. It should always be flowing down to those new projects. In fact, if you're having a trouble visualizing this, we can kind of, don't judge me on my diagramming skills, please. But this is kind of the main idea here, is that we've got this upstream repository where we're starting only projects, but also contains all of our global standardization that we want. And then our downstream projects are all going to pull, or we're going to push global changes down to them. Now, this gets really interesting because we can have layers of upstreams. What I mean by that is that maybe at some point you realize, all right, we have a collection of type of projects. Maybe this is going to be, and I come from a higher ed background, so maybe this is going to be, we've got faculty sites, we've got grant sites, we've got marketing brochureware type sites, and they all share a whole bunch of similarities. So what we could do is we could have one upstream at the very, very top that has all just the base standards. Then we could have categories of project types that pull from them, and then they serve as an upstream for more downstream projects. Again, just thinking in terms of how can we structure this to allow us to have standards at multiple layers. All right, the next piece, now that we kind of have that idea or philosophy, is to consider the option of migrating to using Composer to manage your WordPress sites. If you were in the webinar that Greg Qualls and I did a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the different strategies that you can use to manage WordPress sites, whether that's traditional, like you would usually have with downloading the WordPress core files and then adding plugins, or using Composer, or using Bedrock, which also uses Composer. I'm a strong advocate for using Composer because as we move farther into these strategies, you're going to see it's much easier to adopt some of these later strategies if we're already using it. But briefly, to kind of give you some ideas about these, one big piece is that Composer allows you to explicitly define the dependencies the site has. In general, Composer has us change our idea of how a site, a WordPress site, is built and constructed. Usually we think of a WordPress site as WordPress, and then we're going to add some plugins and some themes. With Composer, and thinking about in terms of dependencies, WordPress is just one dependency out of a bunch of dependencies that, when they all come together, make up our site. So by using Composer and this kind of big global standardization, we can make sure that every project is starting with all of the bare necessity dependencies that we want, and they're all at specific versions or a collection of versions that we want. The other nice thing about Composer versus maybe like the traditional is, let's say at some point you discover that a site downstream has challenges in updating. Maybe you've built a theme that was dependent on a plugin, and they've updated that plugin to a new version, and now that functionality is breaking your site. Well, with Composer, you can go in and say, okay, for this one dependency, I want to pin or lock to that, which allows that one unique case, that one downstream project, to lock itself to that older version, even though the others may continue to move forward. Another big advantage of using Composer is it stores its configuration in a JSON file, which means that you can read that JSON file and extract the requirements and versions that it's using. So it's much more auditable. Now, there's not a single pane of glass. There's not a single console where you can view all of them at once by default with Composer, but it is readable and you have that capability to go in and audit it. It also lends to a more slimmer repository. What I mean by that is if you were to use a more traditional where you're downloading WordPress and then you're storing WordPress core files into your repository, well, you're having to store all of those files in the repository. As you add more plugins, you're having to store all of those. Versus by using Composer, where we're just defining dependencies, the structure of that repository becomes much slimmer. And I'm going to flip screens, hopefully. Hey, oh, and I forgot. All of the sample that I'm going to show you is in my GitHub profile. So if you head out to github.com/Gilzo and look at my repositories, I'm looking at WP Upstream demo. And you can see in this demo, it's really just configuration and structure framework. So I've got the config file. Obviously, we need that. My Composer JSON to define my dependencies. This is my configuration for my infrastructure, some git ignore. The public directory is really just WP config pointing back to the real one, an index, and even the content's just a placeholder. If we look around elsewhere, plugins is just another placeholder, which we'll talk about in a minute. Then I've got some more infrastructure and then some GitHub workflows that I want everybody to have and some testing I want everybody to have. So really just configuration and just framework. All right, take a breath there for a second. The other big advantage of Composer is you don't need a full instance of WordPress to update the dependencies. All you need is a PHP environment and Composer to be able to tell Composer, hey, go check and see what's updated, download or get those updated hashes and record that so that when we then use that file in our WordPress instance, we can build from all those new updates, which means it's much easier to integrate with a CI/CD process. Because as I mentioned earlier, when you usually move to a cloud host and they build out that application container, it's read-only. This allows us then to automate what was automated for us previously. Now, there are some disadvantages. One is you can't update the dependencies in that WP admin console, both because of the cloud infrastructure being read-only in the app container, as well as Composer. We're managing now the dependencies in Composer, so we can't take advantage of that. If you're not used to managing WordPress sites in Composer, there is a little bit of a learning curve, so it can take some time to set up or convert traditional WordPress sites over. But if you are utilizing that upstream strategy and then kind of pushing these standards down, you only have to do that work one time and then can push down to all the rest. The other disadvantage is that it does not integrate well with must-use plugins. If you are not familiar, if you've not heard of must-use plugins, we can have a directory inside of WP content called MU plugins. And any plugins placed inside of that directory are always loaded and they must use, they can't be disabled. But you have to put the bootstrap file for that plugin in the root of that directory. And when Composer installs our dependencies, it installs them into that location as a directory. So we still got some work there that we need to do. This is a good point for Bedrock, though. Bedrock has already added that functionality into their framework for Bedrock. So they've already done that for you. One of the other disadvantages is that some plugins may not work properly. Having used this particular strategy for 6-7 years now, the number of plugins that I've run into that just will not work in this way is less than 10, so it's not a lot. And usually they weren't written following WordPress's own coding styles and guidelines. The other disadvantage is you are dependent on third parties. If you're using Composer directly, that means you're dependent on John P. Block, who has graciously set up a Composer capable version of Core. If you're using Bedrock, then you're using their repository. And in both cases, for plugins and themes, you're using WP packages. So we have a dependency on that third party. However, because all of those sources are at some point inside of a repository, we can still access them in some way. So it's not like we're locked It's not like a vendor lock in any way. There would just be some additional work that needs to be done. However, because there are a lot of people doing this, there would be community support in trying to get you moved over. The last is simply there is no official WordPress support for managing your site in Composer. Again, having said that, there are a ton of articles and guides on how you can manage WordPress with Composer. The last advantage is, and this is where we begin to move into another strategy, is something called a meta package. And this is going to come up, this kind of meta idea is going to come up over and over and over again for the next few minutes, in that what we want to be able to do is have a global thing that allows for downstream projects to make changes where we don't cause any conflicts. So a Composer meta package is a type of Composer package that doesn't have any code, but is really just a collection of requirements. And I happen to have one of these. Let me flip over and I'll show you here. So here's my Composer file. And this one is the project level Composer file. And notice the first, and hopefully this is big enough. It probably doesn't look big enough. Let me zoom in just a little bit. A little bit bigger. There we go. So you can see this first one is a requirement to what I'm calling company name all site requirements. You can kind of think of this as the global Composer requirements. And that Composer file simply has a collection of dependencies that we want everybody to have. We're doing this because those downstream projects are never going to change this particular file. So I'm not going to have conflicts. They'll be making changes back up in their project level Composer file. And I can then define all the dependencies I want to make sure that every project has and is starting from. In addition, I can also then define the versions that I want everybody to have. And this idea, I'm going to keep coming back to, maybe zoom back out just a little bit there. Now, there are some challenges, or I shouldn't say challenges, there are some restrictions on that meta package. And there are some Composer properties that cannot be defined at the meta package level, but still have to be defined back at the project level. Those things are like required dev, prefer stable repositories. The two big ones for you that you'll usually run into are going to either be the config property or the scripts property. If you're wanting to have Composer run some additional scripts, those then have to be still defined at the project level. But even then, let me flip back over. What we usually want to do at that point then is define those things that are kind of global and going to be for every project to be defined those higher up, and it'll allow projects to define things lower down. Not that it won't necessarily cause a conflict, but it should be more easily to identify if there is a conflict. All right, so we talked about Composer and kind of breaking pieces of Composer out into a separate area. We can do the same thing with configurations for other things. So Platform uses YAML for you to define your infrastructure configuration, and our particular YAML parser supports inclusion of other files, including other YAML files, bash scripts, text files. Again, just like that Composer meta, this allows us to break out pieces and parts from a central configuration to those that we know that projects need to change and that probably are not going to change from that global area. Again, with this idea to minimize the downstream conflicts. So if I come back over here, let me bring up that configuration file and I'll zoom in to have a little bit easier time to see that. So you can see that this infrastructure file really just encompasses, for the most part, kind of top level keys, such as the name and even the type. Now I'm simply pointing over to another file. Since we're using Composer, I know everybody has needs a Composer build flavor, so we've left that at this kind of global level. But app type definitely could change from project to project, and app type is how we define both the container that we're using, a PHP container, as well as the version. So in this case, we want everybody to start at 8.1, but absolutely we might want downstream projects to be able to go to 8.2, 8.3, 8.4, 8.5, etc. So by doing it this way, we give that ability to those downstream projects, again, to make that change without having to worry about a conflict from upstream. In addition, this gives you the flexibility for when you come across those unique snowflakes that can't update. Maybe you have a project where you find yourself locked to a version. And by doing it in this method, we can begin having the rest of the projects continue to move forward in their versions while an individual project is locked to that version it needs. So let's zoom back out here real quick. Can we apply this same philosophy to other things? There are other sections of our infrastructure, not infrastructure, but of our configuration of the project that we could also break up. Yeah, think about like WP config, right? For the most part, I'll come over to my WP config. For the most part, zoom in here so you can see this a little better. So in platform, we expose most of the information WordPress needs as an environment variable, so that no matter which environment you're running in, you can always access those. So my configuration file, the WP config file, has been written such that it can go grab those environment variables and create this project. But there is a high likelihood that a downstream project is going to have an individual unique need to add more information or more configuration into this file specific for a plugin or maybe a theme that it needs. So we can add a separate file for that case. We could say, hey, let's add to the global space a WP project or WP config project file. At the global space, it's empty, but allow those downstream projects to add as much as they need. And if it's there, we'll go ahead and include it as needed. Back out again so we can zoom back over. What about local development files? We can apply this same philosophy of kind of breaking these pieces up to local development. So if you're using DDev or Lando, I know Lando has a naming convention they use where I believe it's .upstream.lando is kind of your global space. And then it's like .local.lando and then .lando. And you have a cascading effect where each of those in that specific naming order is going to override previously defined or kind of build them all up together. So we can adopt the same philosophy there so that we're making sure that all of our projects are using the same local development. Again, so that any developer can step into a project and immediately know how to bring up a local instance as well as everything in the configuration is located. But we can also use it for other script files. Maybe you've got some bash scripts or some Python scripts that you're running during the build stage or during the deployment stage that needs to happen. Maybe you've got some areas that are global that you know need to happen for every project, but the individual projects need that ability as well. So you could build in some support there, as well as in your testing. As we moved, or as I get farther into this and talk about testing in your pull request and merge request, we probably want to have things tested on every site, but we know we need downstream projects to be able to add their own unique. So are there ways in whatever testing framework we use where we can pull in individual testing files from those downstream projects as part of that global test? So we've got, at this point, we've got kind of this upstream. We've got projects that are built from that, pulling those changes down. We've got Composer possibly in there, but we're still not to the point where we've gained any efficiency, right? I mean, we can push downstream changes everywhere, but on a day-to-day basis, we've still lost that ability to have those automated updates. And so the next stage then is to move into automating all of those updates. If you happen to be on platform.sh in an enterprise or elite plan, or on Upsun, all plans have access to something called a source operation. It's one of our unique capabilities where in a source operation, we bring up an instance of your of your application container, just the application container, but instead of a read-only state, it's in a writable state. And as you make those changes, you can commit those changes and we push those back to that branch, which means then you can bring up an instance of your PHP application, WordPress, and run Composer update inside of that and have it commit back to that. Now, even if you're not using us, again, hope you do, on other CI/CD systems, you can certainly do a similar thing, like in GitHub. You could use an action on a cron schedule to bring up a PHP environment. You check out your branch and run Composer update. You can even do it locally. When I was at the University of Missouri, this was before source operations were available. We were on a local GitLab instance with a very restricted number of runners. So I built a little application that would simply download each repository, check out the branch, do all the updates, and push it back up to GitLab. So there's multiple strategies you can do for automating this update, depending on what you have access to. But in general, what we want to do is we want to have that individual projects repository, check out some branch where we're going to do all these updates, make sure it is synced and up to date with our production branch, pull down any changes from the upstream and incorporate those, run that composer update, and if there's any updates, commit that lock file, push that back up so that we can then begin to do our pull request, our merge request, and get that into production. Now, you may be finding yourself saying, okay, well, on GitHub, can't I use Dependabot for this? Absolutely. By default, Dependabot will check your project's dependencies. And if it finds any that have security issues, we'll go ahead and create pull requests for you to update those. You can also configure it to run on a cron and just run updates for your dependencies. So absolutely do that if you have access to that. The one thing it won't do, though, is pull from that upstream. So you'd still need to build that into your process. Now, just to show you, and I'm not advocating that this is what you do, but just to show you an example, I've got a workflow in that upstream demo called updates that does exactly what I just talked about. So on GitHub, when you run an action, when you run a workflow, it does not check out your repo. So the first thing we need to do is check out our project's repo. I'm going to go ahead and have it check out everything. From there, I'm going to fetch all the branches, and I'm going to check out the update branch. I'm going to make sure that if it exists, I check out the one that exists in the repo. If it doesn't exist, I create it. And then I simply make sure that I'm up to date with production so that I'm working on the most up-to-date copy of the project. After that, I can add the remote. So that upstream remote, I add that remote, pull down any changes, incorporate that into this update branch, set up some Git configs, and then from there, I can set up my PHP environment where I'm going to run Composer Update. Now, the one piece I have not added into here is we want to make sure in some way that the PHP environment that we're going to run Composer Update matches the PHP environment in production. Having said that, remember in the configuration, if it's a YAML configuration, we can probably read YAML and pluck out that information. Alternatively, if you want, you can define those requirements in your Composer file. And because it's JSON, you could pluck those out. And then you use that information to ensure that this environment has everything and matches your production environment. Although, again, if you're on Platform or Upsun, we've got that source operation, which handles all that for you. Once that's done, though, you can run that Composer update. And if the lock file has been changed or has been updated, we can then commit that lock file back in and then push those changes back to our update branch. So again, just the strategy of how we can now take and re-add this automated update process. And I can now then run this workflow on a schedule. It's currently set to manual, so I can run it whenever I want, or set that up on a cron job and run it on a schedule. All right, so from there, we probably want to start pull request or start a merge request, depending on the system that you're using. And we want to make sure that we're testing these things. That's one of the big things that we want as an enterprise client or as somebody that probably has a bunch, is you never want to have code introduced into production that has not been tested or verified. I did forget one thing, sorry, let me jump back over, and that is that most of the management systems, for your repository management systems, will allow you to, in some way, automate the start of a pull or merge request. And so that's what this particular workflow is doing, is it's watching the update branch and saying, hey, if I see a push to that update branch, I'm going to go ahead and start a merge request. Now, in this case, we have some actions that have already been built because we do this on, like I said, I'm in charge of this. I've already got some actions built up to kind of handle this for me, beginning the generation of those automated PRs. And that reminds me to also remind you that as you are building up any of these CI/CD pieces, definitely be having this same philosophy of what do I need to do at the global level for every project, and what functionality or what abilities do I want to allow for downstream. and make sure you're building these pieces in a modular fashion. So for GitHub, you'd be using reusable workflows and actions. On GitLab, excuse me, I believe they call them components now. So just make sure that even with the CI/CD processes, you're building with this idea of, I want everybody to do this, but I'm going to build in some situations here for downstream projects to be able to add their own. Okay, so now we can jump back into testing. So now we've got the update happening. We've got the PR, MRs starting up once those updates occurred. Now we want to make sure that we're testing these things because we don't want any of these to go into production unless we've verified them. So strongly encourage you to do lint testing, unit testing if you're a test-driven development shop. Do your unit testing. Do some visual regression testing and integration testing and end-to-end testing. If you're not familiar with these types of testing, visual regression testing is where we have a framework. And these are a bunch of different frameworks that goes out to a baseline, or typically like your production website takes a screenshot. Then it goes to your pull request environment that you brought up, takes screenshots. Then it diffs those, and if any threshold of difference has occurred, will warn you or fail. So it allows us to identify anything that has visually changed the website. End-to-end testing, if you're not familiar with those, again, it's a framework typically that we add in, and this simulates or mimics a user moving through our site or application and performing steps. So it allows us to verify that the code that we're introducing into this pull request to go to production has not introduced any regressions into the functionality of the website. And typically you do want to make sure that you're testing both happy paths and unhappy paths. Happy paths are you've simulated the user doing something and they get to a success. They followed the correct path and everything's working exactly as you expect. An unhappy path would be if they've taken paths to get to somewhere that you didn't want them to get, but they get the correct error message. So you want to make sure that you are introducing or you're adding tests to cover both of these cases. But again, with the testing, we want to do that same mentality. We want to have visual regression testing for every site at some baseline level. We want to make sure we have end-to-end testing for every site that's at least testing the commonality between all sites, but then giving each of those individual sites the ability to add in extras. Most of these frameworks typically will use YAML or JSON again for configuration of how the tests are run or the actual tests that they're performing, giving you that ability to possibly read in the global standard as well as the individual product standard, merging them together so you can have a full, complete suite of tests. Now, I did mention one thing, and that is having a pull request environment. And that's extremely crucial when you're trying to do automation and management of a large collection of sites. You really need to make sure that the environment that you're testing mimics production as close as possible. And that is by far one of the biggest values that Platform and Upsun brings, is that we offer integrations with GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket. And when you create a pull request, when you create an MR, it contacts us and tells us. We then take a data complete clone of production. And I do mean complete. It is the app, it's the database, the services, the files, the configuration, everything about production. And we make an exact clone, an instant clone of that environment, and then take that pull request code and put that on top, bring that up, and then send the ephemeral URL for that environment back to that management system, which means then that your workflows, your pipelines, those can then run all of that testing on that environment, and you know that that environment is an exact clone of production, which then gives you a high level of confidence that if you get green check marks, and I happen to have one here that has completed a series. So this is a downstream project that just finished pulling from changes from upstream. It ran Composer update. It got the pull request environment, which should be this right here. So here's that PR environment. It runs visual regression testing. It runs end-to-end testing against this environment. And I know as a developer, I've got green checks across the board. I've run all of these tests in an exact clone of production. I have a high level of confidence that now when I click that merge request button, the merge pull request button, that the code that I'm introducing into production is not introducing any regressions. One additional piece that we offer is that we've already built your application container. There is no change in the code between your pull request and production when you merge that pull request, right? So there's really no need to rebuild the container because it hasn't changed. So we track builds, and if there's no change, then we just move it over. Again, which increases your confidence because now you know the app container you just tested and got green checks across the board is the exact same container that you're now moving into production. So you have that incredibly high level of confidence that you're not introducing any regressions into these. Most of these systems, GitHub, Bitbucket, GitLab, also offer the ability to auto merge if all checks pass. So as you do some iterations of this kind of system, you can get to the point where your tests give you enough confidence to say, all right, we've got green checks across the board. Let's just let it auto merge. And now all of your sites, whether it's 100 sites or 1,000 sites, are updating on a continual basis, but in a managed fashion where you know those changes are not breaking things. Because at any point, any of those tests fail, that auto merge is going to get halted. You'll get alerted, and then you can go in and do manual verifications to find out why any particular test failed. All right, so we've got it. We've got the global strategy where we're pushing changes down or pulling changes down into all the downstream projects. We've broken up dependencies so that we can have upstream dependencies, and individual sites can have their own unique dependencies. We've got configurations with that same philosophy. We've now got a system where we're continuously updating this process, allowing us to have every site up to date on whatever schedule we prefer. What now? What's the next step? Well, this is really like any other programming project. It's time for refactoring. It's time for iterations. The biggest piece that you need to do is you need to make sure that you're tracking every time a project needs to deviate. So anytime one of your devs or anytime you come across a project where the merge from the upstream fails, or anytime somebody comes in and says, all right, I need to deviate a little bit in this section, you need to make sure you're tracking that and watching for that to occur on more than one occasion. If it's just happening one time or a couple of times, that's okay. You can use Git attributes with a merge strategy of ours to say, okay, for this file, we realize that this is in conflict with upstream, but that's okay. We've made this exception, and then you won't have to worry about it causing conflicts from there forward. But if you see this happening over and over, that's a good indication that you need to go back to the upstream and make some changes. It could be that you've identified areas that simply never change, right? And those become good candidates to incorporate back into the upstream as a global section, since you know that's not ever changing. All right, with that, that does kind of conclude the big strategies. I think I've got about 10, 15 minutes left for questions. If anybody has questions, I will let you know as I'm waiting for some help here to notify me of any questions. If you have follow-up questions, I love to talk about this automation stuff. I really thoroughly enjoyed the time I was at the University of Missouri when I got to do this. I thoroughly enjoyed doing it here at Platform and automating hundreds and hundreds of projects that run themselves and update themselves on a daily basis. So love to talk about it. So that's my link tree there. You can scan that to get my contact information. I'm also just Gilzo pretty much everywhere. There's only like a handful of us in the United States. In addition, we're happy to talk to you one-on-one and provide some custom solutions based on your particular needs. So I do believe there should be a form or a link to a form there in the chat that you can fill out, and happy to talk to you about that. Anybody listening in do we have any questions? Or have I thoroughly stumped everybody? There, we do have a question. My question's over here, so sorry about looking over. So what would you say are the most important tests for WordPress to include in your CI/CD pipeline? That is an excellent question. So what I can tell you, most downstream projects are going to differ enough that becomes challenging, right? From a global standpoint, we know that every project should at least come up, right? So the University of Missouri, we were using a style guide. I knew that on every home page, there would be certain HTML elements that will be present and should be visible. We also had certain guidelines of the footer and how they were constructed. So I could run visual regression testing on that home page to make sure that no changes had occurred in the home page. And then I could also test to make sure that certain pieces component-wise on the page should be present on every page. The other piece that I knew every project was going to have was a search feature. So I can run a search and make sure both visually that search page looks the same from PR to production, as well as in the end-to-end testing. I could have a user mimic doing a search and getting to a particular answer that I knew was going to be on every page. From there, again, it really depends on how common or how similar your downstream projects are versus how unique they are. If there are some additional areas you can do. Beyond that, it would be making sure to identify your critical paths. I come from a higher ed background, so if this is the admission site, I definitely want to make sure that a person visiting the site can follow the call to action to apply and that they get to that right location and that nothing's preventing them to getting to that. Potentially, if we have a form that I want to make sure that they can fill out and submit, I'll probably add that to my end-to-end testing to make sure that nothing has happened to that form that would prevent them from doing that. Thank you for doing that. So no questions come in. How would you approach setting up a staging and production site, assuming that it is a content-only website? So here's the challenge I always had with staging sites. In higher ed, for content-wise, your content stakeholders typically carry multiple hats, which means your staging site has to sit for a good amount of time. The rest of the world is not sitting while you're waiting for approvals on that content. So updates still need to occur. So in that case, I would probably have, or what we did often would have the staging site set off on its own. And then we would have separate what I showed you today running, continuously updating the production site. And then on a routine basis, usually manually, we would have a sync between production and pull those changes back into staging, assuming we knew there weren't going to be any visual changes that occurred, like we made updates to the theme or maybe change some plugins in production while we were waiting for that content to change. If I missed the question, let's see. Oh, yeah, I'll come back to that. So I thought maybe this other question was connected. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but the staging ones are hard. Again, mine, I don't have to really deal with staging at platform because ours are more functionality focused. But that was kind of my experience with having to deal with staging sites in general. I will tell you that platform is very agnostic in terms of your workflow. We don't require that you go to staging before you go to production. So that gives you that flexibility to continuously be updating production, possibly while staging is sat waiting for approvals. Another question that came in was, is there a best practice approach for dealing with plugins, premium plugins? Yeah, premium plugins and themes possibly that aren't in Composer. That is also an excellent question. A couple of ways you can deal with this. One is I had that plugins directory placeholder in the repository. So one way you could do this is if you have a custom or premium plugin or theme, is you could commit that code into that repository, and then during the build stage, you copy what's in that directory into the plugin or theme directory that it needs to go to. So that's one method. Another method is you could have a separate repository where you're storing the code for these changes, and you on a basis pull in the updates from that premium plugin wherever you have to go get that code, grab that information or grab that code and commit it into your repository, and then tag it, and then have a Composer file separately in that so that you can still use it in a Composer fashion. You could also, if you're not, sorry, back up here. You can also set up your own SATA instance. SATA is it's like a private Composer package application. It builds a point that Composer can read, and then you can publish what packages you make available. So if you have a collection of premium plugins or themes or custom plugins and themes you need, you could set up your own SATA instance that would then read from those source locations and then make them available to Composer. Any other questions? I'm not sure. Greg, I know you're listening in. Any other questions? I don't see any in the chat. All right. If we don't have any other questions, like I said, I hope this gave you some ideas. I hope this inspired you. Again, if you have any questions afterwards, seriously, feel free to hit me up. I love talking about all things automation. I find it fascinating and exciting. Again, if you're interested in that one-on-one, definitely hit that link in the chat. And otherwise, I'll see you online.